Chapter 24 of A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Muriel. A Treasury of Heroes and Heroines by Clayton Edwards. Grace Darling. The coast of Northumberland in England is rocky and severe, with lofty flint-ledged cliffs where great waves thunder, hurling the white foam high into the air. It is a coast that is feared by vessels, and many wrecks have taken place there. As is usual in such a locality, it is the home of brave fishermen and daring boatmen, who have many thrilling rescues to remember, and many stormy encounters with the utmost fury of the sea. But of all the tales of daring that are talked of by the fisher folk, the bravest of all was performed by a girl whose name was Grace Darling, a name that now is known not only in the places where she lived, but all over the world. Grace Horsley Darling was the daughter of a lighthouse keeper named William Darling, who tended a light on one of the Farne Islands, as his father had done before him. Grace, who was the seventh of 9 children, was born in 1815, in Bamborough, and, when she was a little girl of 11 years, her father was given charge of the new light on Longstone Rock, which was one of a series of dangerous reefs where no vessel ever built could live when a gale was blowing. The highest part of Longstone Rock was only 4 feet above the surface of the sea, and near at hand were 23 other reefs or islands, between which the ocean tides ran in curious currents and eddies, and where the great rollers came racing in with a tremendous roaring to burst upon the base of the lighthouse, and throw the spray high above the light itself. It was a wild spot, even in calm weather, but when a storm blew it became terrible. Then all communication with the mainland was cut off, and for days at a time the only news that the outside world had from the lonely lighthouse keeper was the yellow beam of the lantern that shone from the top of the tower across the desolate expanse of ugly rocks and roaring waters, where any ship that chanced to be entrapped was caught in the grip of strange currents and pounded into matchwood by the breakers. Grace did not find the life at the lighthouse unpleasant. Her father was an intelligent and kind-hearted man, who gave an eye to her education himself, and taught her how to read and write. He was also considered the best boatman on the whole Northumberland coast, the bravest and most skilful, and it was partly due to his reputation in these respects that he was made the keeper of the new light on the Longstone, with a large increase in pay and a comfortable home for his family, for the interior of the lighthouse had several large and pleasant rooms, where the Darlings lived. All of his elder children had gone off to make their living, and William Darling lived with his wife and his daughter Grace, who spent her time in reading, helping her mother with the housework, and, when it was calm, wandering over the rocks observing the gulls, the seaweeds, and the strange sea creatures that the ocean brought to the surface, or that crawled and swam among the more sheltered rock pools. But the confinement of the life in the lighthouse was not good for the growing girl, and Grace never was strong and robust as would be expected from the daughter of fishermen. Nor was she handsome, but she possessed a kindly and winning nature, and, as will be seen, the ability to rise to heights of greatness when necessity called on her to do so. When Grace was a young woman of 23, a terrible storm burst suddenly upon the coast, and in the twinkling of an eye the reefs about the lighthouse were a sea of churning foam, while the great waves racing in from the ocean thundered so mightily at its base that it seemed as though they must tear it from its foundations and sweep it away. A short time before this gale broke, the steamer Forfarshire had sailed from Hull for Dundee in Scotland. She was commanded by a captain named John Humble, and had aboard her, all told, about 63 persons, including the passengers and crew. She was a fine new steamer, well and strongly built, but she had put to sea with her boilers in poor condition, and it had been intended to give them a thorough overhauling in Dundee. When the steamer was off Flamborough Head, the boilers commenced to leak, and the ship's fires were extinguished. They were rekindled and the leak repaired, but just as the Forfarshire was off the Farne Islands, the gale broke with great fury. While pitching in the heavy seas, the boilers leaked terribly. The fires were again put out, and the ship became unmanageable. Sails were hoisted, but were torn to ribbons by the wind. With no propelling power, the Forfarshire rolled helpless in the trough of the sea, and was swiftly borne towards the rocks. Fog and rain made it impossible for the sailors to see until they were in the teeth of the breakers, and then the beam of the lighthouse showed them the wild rocks only a short distance away. Nothing could save them from destruction. With a crash the steamer drove on the Harkers rocks, and remained there, the sea breaking completely over it. Some of the crew launched a boat and escaped, deserting their captain and passengers and the ship. The rest clung to what supports they could find, and held on, expecting instant death. A wave, larger than the rest, picked up the Forfarshire bodily, and drove it down again upon the rocks, breaking it in two. The after half of the vessel was swept away by the seas, with many passengers, and the captain and his wife. All were lost. On the forward part of the ship, about 12 wretched persons remained in most desperate plight, the seas breaking over them and threatening to engulf the remaining portion of the vessel. When day broke, the wreck could be seen from the mainland, but the misery of the unfortunate persons who survived was even more plain to William Darling and his family. Grace begged her father to launch a boat and go to their assistance, but Darling, brave sailor as he was, knew that there was little or no chance of his ever reaching the doomed ship, and shook his head. Then Grace began to plead with her father, telling him it would be better for him to lose his life than to pass by people in such distress, and that she herself would go with him and bear a hand at the oars. Darling was no coward, and the prayers and entreaties of his daughter won the day. He decided to risk launching a boat from the lighthouse. With Mrs. Darling to help them in launching their boat, Grace and her father put forth from the lighthouse, running their boat into the sea in the lee of the rocks, and pulling strongly for the wreck. Father and daughter both labored at the oars, unable to speak on account of the roar of the sea and wind, and blinded by the spray that whirled over them. Their boat was tossed like a shuttlecock in the great waves, and they knew that unless the shipwrecked persons could aid them, it would be impossible to return to the lighthouse. They must succeed or die, and their chance of success was small. Little by little they drew near the wreck. By this time the tide had ebbed sufficiently for the survivors to leave the ship and stand on the slippery rocks. But already some of them had succumbed, and the rest would certainly be washed away and drowned at the returning high water. As the rescuers drew near the reef, Darling leaped ashore, and Grace kept the frail rowboat from dashing itself to pieces against the rocks. Then followed the difficult task of getting the survivors into the boat. One after one waded out as far as he dared, and was pulled over the gunwale. When the last person was aboard, Darling clambered back, and with new hands at the oars, the boat was rowed back to the lighthouse, a trip that required great strength and much time, for the current was against them. And when the light was reached, the shipwrecked people were soon made comfortable and cared for by Grace and Mrs. Darling, and 9 lives were thus saved by the determination of a single girl. In the meantime, and after the gale abated considerably, a boat full of fishermen put out from the shore at a place called North Sunderland, and after nearly being swamped in the high seas, succeeded in drawing near the wreck. They saw that there was no living thing left aboard, and not daring to return to the mainland, in the sea then running, succeeded in reaching the lighthouse. Among them was Grace's brother, Brooks Darling, and the heroism of his achievement and that of the other fishermen was only exceeded by the marvelous feat of the girl herself and of her father. In the course of a few days the fishermen succeeded in returning to the shore, taking with them the news. All England rang with the fame of Grace's exploit, and letters and gifts poured in from every side. Scores of people visited the lighthouse. Grace was feted and admired, and a public subscription in her benefit resulted in a gift of £700, or about $3,500 of our money. She also received 4 medals and a large sum of money in private gifts. Grace and her family took their new prominence with great good sense and modesty, and disliked the publicity which came to them. They were astonished at the commotion their exploit had caused, for to them it appeared little more than a part of the day's work that duty required them to perform. But Grace did not live long after her exploit. Her confined life at the lighthouse, and the exposure she underwent there, resulted in the disease of consumption, from which she rapidly wasted away. In spite of the best medical aid, she steadily drooped, and 2 years after she had done her brave deed, she died in the town of Bamborough, where she had been born. Again a subscription was collected, and a monument was erected in her honor. Her father and mother lived to a ripe old age, reaping benefits from the money that Grace had left them. Perhaps some of their descendants are still tending the light at the present day, but at all events the name of the Darlings has been made immortal by the bravery of this girl. End of Chapter 24. Recording by Muriel.